I'm Sophia Amargi. Welcome to the Sophia Amargi Show. Let's get hip to the trip. I am a licensed psychotherapist and I specialize in healing trauma. I'm also certified in providing EMDR, which was designed for single incident trauma relief. It is bilateral brain stimulation, activating the right and left hemispheres of the brain so they can communicate with each other. Under trauma, or particularly a traumatic accident or incident, the brain bridge that connects the right and left hemisphere gets damaged or broken. And so when we start to talk about PTSD, PTSD is actually when an individual is looping around in a picture of a traumatic event, but doesn't have access to the language to work it through. So the right hemisphere holds the picture, the left hemisphere holds the language capacity. To resolve trauma, we have to talk about what actually happened in the right hemisphere, the picture, and we talk about it because we need to access the left hemisphere, the language, and then we can work it through with feelings, thoughts, and beliefs about what happened and what it means to us about ourselves. So EMDR is designed to repair the bridge that connects the right and left hemispheres of the brain so they are in communication with each other and trauma can be resolved. So I'm a certified EMDR provider. I have a private practice in Corona del Mar and in Laguna Beach. And if I were to be asked, how is it that I came to be a trauma therapist? My answer would be that I understand something about trauma in a kind of a particular and let's say unique way. Here's what I mean. I work with a pattern or a schema of trauma, story, belief. So let's say we have a traumatic event. And a trauma is a trauma if the individual experiences something as traumatic. So we could consider trauma as early childhood sexual abuse or a terrible car accident when the whole family was killed and the individual is the only survivor. Or a traumatic event could just be if a mother hurts the feelings of a child, but the child experiences that as traumatic. So trauma, story, belief. We have a traumatic event. Right away, the brain unconsciously makes a story about what just happened and what does it mean to us about ourselves. So let's say Susie's 6 years old and she's in first grade and she goes to school that day and all of her little friends are really mean to her and she doesn't know why. She hasn't done anything, but her feelings are hurt and she's ostracized. And so all day long, she's waiting to get home and see her mom because mom's going to make it feel better and mom is going to provide comfort and soothing. So when Susie gets home at the end of the day, she says, "Mommy, Mommy." But what Susie doesn't know is that Mommy has been dealing with her little brother all day long, so afraid that her little brother is going to be dehydrated and maybe get really, really sick and die because he's been pooping and throwing up all day and Mom is at the end of her rope and has no more internal resources to deal with Susie. So Susie gets home and says, "Mommy, Mommy." And Mommy says, "Susie, can't you see I'm busy with your little brother? Don't bother me. Go outside and play." And right there, something traumatic has happened to Susie. And the brain makes a story. What just happened? And what does it mean to me about myself? Maybe if I were somehow different than who and what I am, my mom would have met my needs. She would have provided comfort. Maybe I need to be different than who and what I am. Maybe there's something wrong with who and what I am. Maybe my mother likes my little brother more than me. So now we have the formation unconsciously of a story. So we have the original traumatic event, and then we have the story that's formed. But Susie doesn't even know that there's a story there. There must be something wrong with me. Unhealed and untended over time, that story becomes a limiting belief. There must be something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not likable. Oh, I'm not even lovable. And people are living from their beliefs that are connected to a story, that are connected to an original wound. And when we hear the expression, the walking wounded, this is actually what we're talking about, is a series of individuals, hundreds, thousands, maybe even billions, that are living in a wound-driven life, unconscious, and they don't even know it. So they're living this trauma story belief, I'm not lovable. And then there's another traumatic event, and they're living the trauma story belief that has to do with that. And then there's another traumatic event, and so on, because it's impossible to grow to adulthood without being traumatized on some level. This is certainly my opinion, but I think that you would agree with me that it's true. And so here's Susie, unconsciously living a belief. I'm not lovable. My mother must like my brother more. There must be something wrong with me. I need to be somehow different than who and what I am, because then I would have gotten my needs met. When we talk about how I must be somehow different than who and what I actually am, we're actually looking at the beginning of something called the development of the false or the constructed self. Meaning, if Susie is living in a wound, and I will use the expression wound and trauma interchangeably, and the wound is there must be something wrong with me, then Susie would begin to contort and behave in ways that are not authentic. In order to cover up this wounded place, there must be something wrong with me. Because Susie doesn't want anybody to know that there's something wrong with her. She certainly doesn't want anybody to know that maybe she's not lovable. So behavior begins to change. And the individual quite unconsciously begins to contort and pervert and adjust in order to cover up this wounded place. And so, instead of living from the authentic self, we have somebody who's living from a false or a constructed self. And this is very important because for all of us, we want to live a life that's fully self-actualized, with meaning, with purpose, from an authentic place where it feels good to be who we are. But when we are living in a wound-driven existence, nothing feels good. It absolutely does not feel good to be who and what we are. And to some degree, it feels like we're wearing an ill-fitting suit that we're continually trying to adjust ourselves to fit into. So this is a little piece of information about the false or the constructed self. And people are living hundreds and thousands of trauma story beliefs. The walking wounded are not living their truth, they're living their beliefs. Where I come in is to help people unwind from each and every trauma, story, belief, pattern that is attached to their neurology, meaning this. Our nervous system is our first brain, and our brain that lives in our head is our actual second brain. So we feel things in our first brain, right here in our gut. And you all know that many times in a lifetime, people say, I wish I had listened to my gut, or my gut told me otherwise. But I didn't listen to my gut. I overrode my felt sense and did something that ultimately worked against me. Okay, well, our gut will never lie to us. And the reason that that is true is because the somatic experience, the soma being the body, the psyche being the mind, you all know psychosomatic. That means somebody is having an experience actually in their body, but it's based on a belief that they're holding in their mind, a psychosomatic experience. But if we look at just the soma or the body, we are looking at the nervous system, the autonomic, the sympathetic, and the parasympathetic. Well, the parasympathetic part of the nervous system is connected to the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is directly connected to your neural patterning. And so, Susie, who felt, when her mother said go outside and play and dismissed and diminished her upset, she felt it in her nervous system first. And right away, the parasympathetic responded by sending a message through the vagus nerve up to her neurology. And the message was, there must be something wrong with me. I'm not lovable. And so, whenever there is an external event or some type of stimulus that activates Susie's original traumatic felt experience that the vagus nerve first felt, then Susie, if it remains untended and unhealed, will always go back to that original trauma state. And here's the wildest thing. I love John Bradshaw because John Bradshaw has a whole theory, and shout out to John Bradshaw, that all of us are kind of fragmented in early unresolved trauma. So we all have an internal timeline from 0 to our current chronology. And if Susie was originally traumatized at the age of 6, and it remains unhealed. Every time there's an external stimuli that activates that feeling of, I'm not lovable, there must be something wrong with me, Susie slides out of current chronology, and she could be 50 years old. And she goes right back to the age of 6 when this first traumatic event or wound occurred. And the thing is so crazy is that when she goes and slides younger to 6, she has no access to actual 50-year-old capability. She, like all of us, will respond to the external stimuli from this younger age of 6. This is just super wild. And it's totally true. And I see that with my clients all the time, where people are externally activated by some type of stimulus, usually a relational one, and they slide to a younger age, and then they respond, let's say inappropriately, to whatever's going on, but it's because they're responding from 2 or 4 or 6 or 11 or whatever age this first felt experience occurred. So I love John Bradshaw, and I work with this idea all the time with my clients. And the way through is to identify this younger space, this younger age, to identify the original trauma that occurred, and then heal it, grow it into current chronology, integrate it, and then it no longer exists as a standalone, fragmented part of the self. The end goal being that the individual is completely consolidated, whole, and always is moving from current chronology because there are no more standalone, fragmented parts. This is also important because what I'm seeing in my practice now is very interesting. I'm seeing a whole lot of my clients who are not showing up in the adult world with a lot of ego resiliency and ego robustness. What do I mean about that? Well, I mean that if somebody, let's say, has a thin skin or really struggles with criticism or can't really take direction, I always want to know why. What is going on? So if we look at early childhood development, 0 to 5, then we're looking at an actual minefield of developmental trajectories, developmental hurdles that have to be navigated. 0 to 5 is the most important time in a child's life. Why? Because when a child is first born, a lot of their neurology, a lot of their optic nerves, a lot of the hard wiring of the brain itself is not fully set. And in fact, doesn't get set until 2.5 when the fontanelle closes. So why do we call 2.5-year-olds the terrible twos? What does that even mean, the terrible twos? First stage of childhood is when we have an infant, and the infant stays right here between breast and shoulder on the mother. That's called a symbiotic relationship. By the end of the first year, the infant's head is turned outwards to see the larger world, and it begins to develop a sense that I am somehow not attached to my mother. We are two separate beings. By the time that infant becomes 2 or 2.5, Sigmund Freud talks about how this is when the id drops in. Id is ID, and what it means is primitive drive, animalistic almost, single-mindedness. I want what I want because I want it. I want a lollipop, Mommy. Can't have a lollipop, honey. We're going to have dinner soon. But for the 2-year-old, there is no later or there is no soon. There's only right now. And the 2-year-old has no frustration tolerance. So the 2-year-old says, I want a lollipop. I want a lollipop. And the mom says, well, you can't have a lollipop. We have to wait. You can have it after dinner. And then we have a 2-year-old meltdown, a tantrum, some kind of crazy losing themselves altogether. Because the 2-year-old literally feels that if its need is not met, it will die, it will explode, it will melt down. And so you can go to Safeway, you can go to Whole Foods, and you can go to Trader Joe's, and you can see 2.5-year-olds melting down all the time. This is where the child needs to develop frustration tolerance. So what I see often are parents harshly talking to their child, threatening their child, or punishing their child in public if the child can't get a hold of itself and stop having a tantrum. But the thing is, the 2-year-old literally cannot do that. It's an unrealistic expectation. So what the 2-year-old needs is for the parent to, in essence, learn the 2-year-old its healthy ego until it can develop an ego sense of self on its own and say to the child, this is really hard for you. I will help you. We will get through it. And then the child is resourced. Then the child feels more capable and competent with help to get through the navigation and to develop frustration tolerance to wait until after dinner for the lollipop. By 3 or 3.5, Freud says the ego drops in. And the ego is that sense of I am me and you are you and we are not the same. And with healthy egoic development, we need to feel capable and masterful and confident. How do we do that at the age of 3? Well, when the ego is dropping in, toilet training is also occurring. And the child needs to feel masterful, that it has mastery over its biological functions. So when 3-year-olds or 3.5-year-olds are really excited and happy that they were able to put a poopy in the potty, they need to be validated, recognized, and idealized. Yay, what a good job you did. You're amazing. I'm so proud of you. Because this gives them a sense of I can, I did, I'm capable, I'm competent, and I'm masterful. But what happens when that child does not get what it needs to develop a healthy sense of egoic self, the I am? What happens later in life is it has very little egoic capacity, not any resilience, not any ability to bounce back. You all know when people say, oh, you're so sensitive. Well, I always want to look at what was going on when the ego was dropping in and developing. By the time the child is 4, 4.5, the superego drops in, also Freudian. And that is that kind of overarching governing body that monitors appropriate social behavior. So a 2-year-old, if their toy is taken away by another child, will immediately, completely id-driven, primitive drive, reach out, hit, pinch, or bite the other child. But a 4.5-year-old will not do that because now it has superego functioning and it understands social appropriate behavior with its own peer group. So all of these things are very important because I'm always looking at what happened in early childhood and how does it impact adult functioning. There's something else I want to share with you. That between 0 and 5, there have to be 4 very particular things in the child's environment reflected to them by their caregivers or their parents. And those 4 things are idealizing, mirroring, affective attunement, and empathy. Now, what do I mean by mirroring? Mirroring is for the parent or the caregiver to reflect to the child an accurate reflection of itself. Meaning, if we have a child and the child looks sad and the mom says, oh, honey, you look sad. What's going on? And the child says, I am sad. And the mom says, you're not sad. Go outside and play. Right there, the mother is interrupting, invalidating, and dismissing a core experience that the child is having of itself. Over time, if we get enough of this inaccurate mirroring, the child starts to doubt its own feeling states. But if we have a child and the child looks sad and the mom says, honey, you look sad. What's going on? And the child says, I am sad. The mom says, aw, you want to sit with me and we can be sad together? Or do you want to talk to me about it? We could just sit together. Would you like me to make you a hot chocolate? Sometimes people are sad. If we have that as our experience consistently, it's an accurate reflection of our felt sense of self. And we begin to grow into trusting that our experience of what we feel is safe and good and true. And it makes it easy to move through the world from an authentic connection to what we feel. That feels safe. But when we're constantly being told that we feel something that we don't, again, comes the development of the false or the constructed self, preceded by a disconnect over time of an authentic feeling of self. So we stop being able to trust that what we feel is true and right and good. The next thing that has to be consistently in play for the child, 0 to 5, is empathy, having empathy for the experience of the child. So when a child falls down on the playground and scrapes its knee and comes running over to mom, mommy, there is a mommy that says, oh, honey, what happened? And the child says, I scraped my knee. And the mommy says, come here, baby. Let me hold you and kiss it. I'll make it all better. Let's put a Superman Band-Aid on that. About 4 minutes of that, and the child is good to go. It's gotten an accurate mirror, its experience is validated, and it was given empathy. Mom was recognizing that falling down off the jungle gym and skinning its knee was an event, and she made it okay. But same child, same jungle gym, same playground, different mom, and the child runs over and says, "Mommy, mommy." And the mommy says, "Oh, you're such a baby. Stop that crying. Stop that crying. You're embarrassing me. Get away from me. You always make such a big deal over everything. Stop being such a crybaby. Go, get back out there." Again, an utter invalidation of the experience of the child that it's having of itself. Again, over time, it stops trusting itself in its own experience, and it certainly stops having empathy for itself in its own experience. Next, we're going to look at affective attunement. What does that mean? It means that when a baby is crying in a crib, we don't let it cry. The good enough mother, and we'll get to what that is in a minute, the good enough mother will come in and pick up the baby. Is the baby wet? Is the baby cold? Is the baby hungry? What's going on? When we see behavior in a child, the goal in good enough parenting is not so much to respond to the behavior, but to view the behavior as information about the feeling state of the child and to be attuned to what that is. How is the child presenting? And we notice the presentation. And what does the presentation actually mean? What's the information in it? To be affectively attuned is to attune to the affect of the child's presentation of itself. Very important. If we're not attuned, then we're missing stuff, and the child's experience is going unrecognized. Pet peeve of mine, people, are all of the electronic devices that moms and dads are on almost all the time, and we have a 5-year-old trailing behind, having its experience, wanting to share it with mom or dad, but mom and dad are on the phone, not looking, not noticing, certainly not affectively attuned to what's going on with their own child. That's a problem. Next, we are going to look at idealizing. Here we are again at that 3-year-old experience. I was able to put poopy in the potty. I'm so proud of myself. Look what I can do. Idealizing. We want our 3.5-year-olds to be able to walk around the house stark naked, wearing mom's garden hat, dad's slippers, banging on a pot and pan, and feeling like the king of the world or the queen of the world. We want that child to feel like it's the smartest, the best, the most creative, the most fun, the most delighted in. That's idealizing. So for healthy ego development, as the ego is dropping in, we want to really practice accurate idealizing, which builds mastery and competence. Very important. So the child develops a healthy sense of itself. When I'm teaching my workshop, I'm often questioned by people attending who say, "But doesn't this give the child a big head? Doesn't it give them a swelled head? Doesn't it make them narcissist or something? Doesn't this really make them all egoic?" And the answer is absolutely not, because healthy idealizing allows for a template to form internally so the child can feel itself as competent, masterful, and capable. And that becomes an internal foundation of self. So again, we have to have idealizing, mirroring, affective attunement, and empathy. And this has to be in play consistently from 0 to 5 for healthy psychological development. If we look at the landscape of 0 to 5, one of the most important things, developmentally speaking, is that a child feels safe in the world. So if a child is well treated, well loved, treated with respect, that its desires are important. If we have a child that says, "I don't like carrots," when carrots are served for dinner, the parent doesn't say, "Yes, you do, you like carrots." The parent says, "What would you like instead?" She doesn't invalidate what the child said by saying, "You do too like carrots, go on, eat them." So being well treated and treating your children well sets an internal template for what we would call a secure attachment, meaning that the child will securely attach to its parent or caregiver because it feels safe in the world. Now, if the child's trust is broken, if it trusts its mother to pick it up from preschool, but mom doesn't come until 3 hours later, if the child tells its parent a secret and the parent says, "I'll keep your secret," but she actually tells somebody else and the child finds out, If early childhood trust is broken, Erik Erikson says, it is the most difficult wound of all to try to repair. And if the trust is broken and the caregivers don't feel safe to the child as a result, then the world at large also doesn't feel safe. And this is an individual in adulthood who can be quite frightened of striking out on their own or taking risks. And through taking risks and trying new things is how we all grow. So I really want to notice this notion of trust and how it is a critical component to a healthy sense of self and safety in the world. Now, I've referenced a good enough mother several times already. And this is a Winnicott phrase, who is a developmental theorist. And Winnicott says, this is what the good enough mother is. She gets it right a third of the time. She gets it wrong a third of the time. And another third of the time, she goes back and she says, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. So she takes responsibility for getting it wrong and makes the repair. That actually is how trust can be repaired for young children in early childhood. So we want a safe environment so the child can trust that it's safe, trust its caregivers, trust that the world at large is a safe place to explore, and this provides a secure attachment. If we start to look at abandonment and betrayal, then we're looking at a child whose parents say one thing and do another, placing them out of integrity. We're looking at a child whose trust is broken or perhaps betrayed. As a trauma specialist, I've heard a lot of stories, a lot of experiences of my clients over the years of early childhood sexual abuse, promises made and broken, placing the child in harm's way with, let's say, drug addicted or criminal types of parents, many things like this. If the child cannot trust that it's safe and that the parent says one thing and will actually do that one thing, if the child can't trust that, then we're looking at the wounds of abandonment and betrayal. And it doesn't need to be a physical abandonment. We're really talking about emotional abandonment, dismissing what's important to the child, invalidating the child's experience, telling the child that it's wrong to feel or think or want anything that's authentic and true. So now we're looking at an abandonment and betrayal wound. And if we fast forward into adulthood, we have a whole group of adults who cannot securely attach, but instead they're either anxious and ambivalent in their attachment or they're avoidant in their attachment. And the anxious ambivalent attachment style has to do with, come here, come here, come here. I never hear from you. We don't spend enough time together. To, oh my goodness, go away, go away, go away. You're way too close. You're crowding me. I don't have any space to breathe. This is the shifting sands that the adult experienced in childhood, where one day mom responded kind and lovingly, and the next day mom was angry, punitive, punishing, and shaming. So those shifting sands that are connected to the betrayal and abandonment wounding make for adult attachment styles that are ambivalent and anxious or avoidant. And the avoidant attachment style is seen in adults who, in their early childhood, their vulnerability and dependence was somehow used against them. Meaning, when a small child cries because its feelings are hurt, but it's ridiculed and it's shamed for having its feelings hurt, over time, this is a child that learns that being honest and authentic with what it's actually feeling is unsafe. And so attaching to someone and being intimate, emotionally intimate, would be about the most unsafe thing in the whole world. So it is avoidant, and the avoidancy is around emotional connection and attachment. And if we really start to notice this, these various kinds of wounds that have to do with early childhood development and the connection to adult functioning, we have to notice two things. One, the wound or the trauma itself is taking place within a relational overarch. So first, the child is in a relationship with its parents and caregivers, but second, within that context of that relationship, these traumas or wounds are occurring. So when an individual comes into therapy, both the relational trauma has to be repaired through the client's relationship with the therapist in trust and safety, and the original trauma has to be healed as well. Okay, so far we have 3 different attachment styles: secure, anxious, ambivalent, and avoidant. And the fourth and final attachment style that we see in adulthood is the disorganized attachment style, meaning this is where our intimacy and relationships are utterly unsafe, and so they will be avoided at all costs. This comes from a childhood of often violence, parental drug addiction, alcoholism, gang-related behavior, things like that. We get a disorganized attachment style where the adult is actually presenting as a whole bunch of fragmented parts of the self. It's an unconsolidated self. So lots of trauma fragments floating around, and they literally cannot sustain a one-to-one relationship. When we talk about a secure attachment, an additional piece to that is how important it is for the child to do something that's called cathecting. That also means internalizing. When we have a good parent who shows up, who is affectively attuned to the needs of the child, that parent or caregiver is experienced by the child as a good object. Now, we often see small children with a little blankie or a special stuffed animal, and they kind of get panicky when they don't have that. That's known as a transitional object. It helps them transition from the attachment to mom to a more individuated functioning in the world. And the transitional object is an object of self-soothing, when ideally and prior to the foray out into the world with the transitional object of blanket or special stuffed animal, mommy was there and she was able to soothe right away because she was affectively attuned. So when we have an affectively attuned parent who's available to meet the needs of the child, then we have a child who can more or less easily transition from home to preschool. And oftentimes the transitional object will accompany them. The child has to cathect or internalize the good object, which would be mom. And if that doesn't happen, the child is actually not able to separate from mom in a healthy way. So if we drop our children off at preschool, we see some kids that look like they have a healthy, robust, egoic sense of self. They've internalized their good object of mom, and they know that mom might leave them there for 3 hours. But if she's not physically there with them, they've internalized her goodness, her momminess, her loving kindness. And so that will sustain them until she returns. But if mommy is not a good object and she's not affectively attuned, if mommy's a bad object and if she's mean to this child, uncaring, abusive in some way, then the child internalizes a bad object. And if the child is carrying around this notion of caregiver as bad, the child cannot self-soothe. And when we drop that child off at preschool, this is the child that has a meltdown. This is the child that has some kind of a terrible wound around not being in physical proximity to its caregiver. It doesn't feel safe. It doesn't trust that its needs will be met. And it becomes terribly, terribly frightened. Because if we have a 2-year-old who's playing with a ball and the ball rolls behind the sofa, that 2-year-old will burst out crying, thinking that the ball fell into a void in the universe, never to be seen again. But by the time the child is 3.5, the child knows that the ball is now behind the sofa and it can go and retrieve it, meaning it's an object that the child has some relationship to, and it hasn't lost the object forever. A lot of you understand this because your own children freak out when you leave the living room to go pick up a cup of tea in the kitchen and the child starts screaming and crying. It doesn't believe that you're actually going to return. But if you have been cathected, i.e. internalized, then the child carries you around as a self-soothing good object, waiting for your return and feeling safe until you do return. I had a client, she was 65 years old. She came into therapy because she was in a 12-year relationship with a man and it was ending and she was being left for a younger woman. And there had been no provision for her, financially or otherwise, should this relationship break up. She just trusted him, even though in early childhood, she had multiple experiences in her own family of origin of her trust being broken. But she was in her wound, she was in her unconscious traumatized experience and entered into the relationship agreeable to have no proviso in place should the relationship end and they were not married. So she came to therapy one day and I opened the door to my office and she looked awful. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "I feel terrible." She had had a fight that morning right before therapy with the man that was leaving her for someone else. And she said, we had a fight, and I just want to walk into my closet, close the door, sit on the floor, and cry. Now, that is a very unusual response to an upsetting event for a 65-year-old woman. It's a perfectly normal response for a 3.5-year-old or a 4-year-old to want to go into the closet, close the door, sit on the floor, and cry. So the first thing that I said to her was, how old are you right now? Because she understood the landscape of sliding around on the internal timeline because of trauma unhealed. And I said, what happened at 3? And she told me a very upsetting, very painful story of a public humiliation and shaming in front of a large grouping of people when she was 3 years old. And so in that moment, with her relationship partner that was currently ending, her abandonment betrayal wound was activated. She wasn't safe. She went right back to that time where her trust was broken. So now she's in the abandonment betrayal wound. She's in the early trust wound. And she's responding to the external world from a 3-year-old perspective, meaning, I just want to go into my closet, close the door, sit on the floor, and cry. And so that session and the session following, we worked with that traumatized 3-year-old. We healed her, we grew her into current chronology, and then we integrated her so she was no longer a standalone part of my client's psyche.